It's no small irony that I have a small infant child with an iPhone in his hand. The title.
Hey, I'm using presentations.
It's very interesting, right? It's also very practical, right? So I think it has a very broad appeal. There's kind of an idea, right, that the technology, the hope of a lot of technology, and just faith in progress, that religion would be something that diminished, right? The role of religion in society would diminish. The past century has taught us that that is not true at all, right? In fact, religious adherence has gone up proportionately compared to in the previous century. It raises some very interesting points, especially in the idea, though, of a blind faith in technology to continuously improve the world and solve our problems, which in of itself can be a major stumbling block when we're dealing especially with ancient Christianity. So thank you very much.
So I'm aware that the title can be kind of confusing, or you may not know what exactly it means, but I've come here to convince you that it's actually extremely relevant to more than just Orthodox Christians or even religious people in general. So anyways, I'm just going to jump straight into how I formulated it, because it's kind of hard to just introduce it. So as an Orthodox theology major, trying to figure out what I was going to write about, the first thing I asked myself was basically, in what ways is Orthodox theology important today? And then from there, I basically asked myself, well, what are some important topics in general today? And from there, basically, I thought of technology. It seems, if you look at AI, virtual reality, smartphones, biomedical advances, biotechnological advances, it obviously seems like a very important topic for more than just theology majors. So from here, I basically asked myself, well, how can I relate theology then to technology? And then I asked myself, well, why has theology and religion and religious thought in general become so marginalized in today's society? And it seems quite obvious that it's because basically public thought, discourse, politics basically has been thoroughly secularized. Thus, theology, what it is known as the science of sciences, has been reduced to basically mere opinion and holds no weight in public discourse. And what I mean by science of sciences is basically theology was supposed to be the discipline that basically informed the rest. Whether you're talking about science, engineering, mathematics, it was supposed to, through basically its metaphysical, philosophical, and ultimately divine revelation, its premises would be able to guide everything in a humane manner, I guess you could say, or a divine human manner. Especially if you see in Western science, definitely it comes from a Christian background. So then why? Does this happen? Obviously, it seems that there's a conflict in worldview that has occurred throughout the centuries. So from here I thought, well, obviously there's a difference between the spiritual and the secular worldview. And then I asked myself, well, which one does theology support and which one does technology support? And obviously it seems that theology supports a spiritual worldview, or at least a metaphysical worldview. I think people could at least say that. And then basically I had this idea that it seems like technology, at least as we see it today, supports a secular worldview. So then I asked myself, well, does modern technology then have any influence on the Christian's path to salvation? Which is, I guess, a very practical way of putting it. And after some research, it definitely seemed so. And my thesis statement is basically, modern technology supports a secular worldview which is in many ways at odds with Orthodox Christianity, and really religion and religious thought in general. But I come from an Orthodox Christian standpoint for many reasons. I also think that the depth of its dogma and revelation allows you to really plumb these depths. So, sources. What did I use to research this? First off, I come from ancient and contemporary church fathers, like Father Maximus Constus. He actually visited, I think he's been here twice. And he actually spoke on this topic, and he wrote an article in 2015 called Attentiveness and Digital Culture. And there is a certain abbot, Archimandrite who wrote a really interesting article called The Orthodox Christian and the Boundaries of Contemporary Medical Technology, which he talks about how basically our how we understand ethics and really the spiritual life can be affected by biotechnology through various manners, which I'll delve into both of these later. I also pull from cultural critics and philosophers like Neil Postman. He's an acclaimed cultural critic. He's not alive anymore. He wrote another book called Entertaining Ourselves to Death. I don't know if he's a Christian, but definitely he's conservative. And what he's saying definitely, especially in Technopoly, really works well with what I'm saying. Philip Sherrard, he's an Orthodox historian, philosopher kind of figure. He wrote this great book called The Rape of Man and Nature, which I read, and basically he talks about just the scientific worldview, let alone the technological worldview. If you let science basically to its own devisings without anything like theology informing it, basically it has to lead to the destruction of man and nature because it desanctifies him. It secularizes him. And statistical, I also pull from statistical research, news and academic articles. Basically, I show positive correlations between time spent with technology and rises in depression, suicidal thoughts, etc. And also, I do this with these two to increase relevance. In other words, it's not just religious people are talking about this, it's far from the reality. So, to jump into it, introduction and defining terms. Technology. What is its purpose? I don't know if many people think about this, but basically, technology, it's got a kind of a broad definition. So it's basically, at the end of the day, it's a utilitarian force, and basically it finds its value through material use and effectiveness, which may not make much sense now, but I'll show some examples. So even though technology and the creation of technologies and inventions is inherently neutral, it is up to those who use and create the technologies to decide how much influence and power it will have. So eyeglasses, you can see that as a form of sight technology, which is a positive thing. But then you also have nuclear bombs, which is a form of technology, which is kind of negative, I would say. It definitely is. So here's some other examples. Shovels, digging technology. Pencils, writing technology. Chairs, sitting technology. I don't know if you've ever thought about it that way.
Sitting technology.
You don't just pick chairs from trees, right? Like you have to make them, so it is a form of technology. But because they're relatively primitive, they exert much less influence on our day-to-day life, and maybe in our psychology as well. We don't really think about it this way, and I think that's normal. So then from here, though, you have to look at computers, genetic engineering, nuclear bombs, etc. These are extremely advanced, and these are all modern forms of technology, and thus they exert much more influence, not just in our daily life, but also in our psychological, philosophical, and what I argue, primarily our spiritual understanding. So, in my thesis, I go over its utilitarian values. It's inherently utilitarian. Like, that's the whole point of technology, is that it wouldn't be a piece of technology. It would just, if it didn't have some kind of material effectiveness or gain. So, and this affects things like, I go over in my thesis, our social interactions. It affects how we perceive ourselves socially. It affects how we understand education and ethics, especially through biotechnology. So the thing about it is that because it's utilitarian, that means it's also materialistic. And because of that, basically, it can only answer how, but it cannot answer why. And because of this, basically because it's so pervasive, modern forms of technology in day-to-day life, it's basically changed their definitions without our perception. So I'll use some examples. So social interactions. So obviously we know social technology, I guess that's one way to put it, like phones, emails, social media. So it can tell us how we can be more connected, right? It can give us the means through phones and all these things, but it can't tell us why. What's the point of being social? What is the point of all these things? So for Orthodox Christians, man is not merely a social animal, as Karl Marx and others have said. And through this thinking, like Karl Marx, they thought that basically through social restructuring, they could create utopias, because they basically saw thought man as a secular social animal. And that ended in communism, which ended with hundreds of millions dead. So for Orthodox Christians, love of one's neighbor, which is basically that's really the depth of what we know as social beings, I guess you could say. Love of one's neighbor is tied up with the love of God. And in fact, you can't have one without the other. And actually, love of one's neighbor is actually a divine revelation. It's a part of, it is a revelation of what it means. It's a part of the revelation of what it means to be made in God's image. And in fact, the fall, sin, and death, all these things, they're actually, they're not a result of, as the West often sees it, as God being angry at us and thus damning us to hell, but is in fact, it's a form of, death is a form of disconnection to God's grace. So you can see that basically, socially speaking, with God, we're actually cut off. And that leads to death and decay and all that. So thus, through basically the incarnation of Christ and through the establishment of his church and the sacraments, we see that eating the body and blood of Christ, the God-man, is known literally as communion. It's literally communication. And literally, the mysteries of God are recommunicated to the faithful, as the priest says, for the remission of sins and life everlasting. So you see that the establishment of communication with God actually reestablishes eternal life. So then from there, from that perspective, we have to ask, well then what do phones, what do emails, how do they fall into this? And basically what I say is that even though they're good, they're inherently reductive forms of I guess, social technology, I guess you could put it. It reduces the person. I'm not the only person that says this and thinks this. Father Maximus, who I brought up earlier, he says that, in his paper, he says that living in a culture of organized distractions, our thoughts are isolated and disconnected, preventing us from experiencing the wholeness of life, each other, and God. And in fact, the early church fathers know distraction. They know it as the original sin of the mind. That is, Adam and Eve, before they sinned, in fact, they had to be distracted by the devil and his enticements. And so distraction and sin is actually seen as the fragmentation of the person and the personality. So it's interesting to see that even though we're surrounded with devices that can make us more connected than ever, it's interesting to see that suicide and depression are way on the rise. And it seems that it's because these things are inherently reductive. And as I put it with social media, basically, the individual is essentially, it's not like it tends to do this. It has to essentially reduce the person to a profile picture and the sum of their posts. Basically, the depth of who they are and the person is not being connected or fed. So let's look at technology's effects on education. So ruled by utilitarian values, education only cares about how to raise its students' grades, but not at all about why this would be important in the first place. Because it can't ask why. So basically, things like wisdom, which you could say is the pinnacle of asking why for education, is basically, because it's unquantifiable, it's been outdated in most modern educational systems, and that's why basically you'll find basically just lip service being paid to wisdom and the pursuit of truth. So basically, education has reduced learning to the what I call the computer-like qualities of data storage and retrieval. And basically, students have been programmed to become human search engines, which are basically people like Google. Oh, hey, I didn't mean it. Sorry. It's okay. Sorry. So students have basically been turned into human search engines, which are people basically like Google, people indifferent and thus radically unable to appreciate what they've been programmed to learn. And people often call this regurgitation of information or just parroting or the like. And Philip Sherrard, the Orthodox philosopher who I mentioned earlier, he says that scientific knowledge, which is only one way of understanding the world, which is inherently also a materialistic and factual understanding of the world, and not a spiritual understanding of the world. Basically, scientific knowledge has become the only way of knowing there is in today's society. And it has invaded the classical fields of the humanities, making understanding poetry, for example, almost inaccessible to the modern student. But why? Why is this? Ultimately, I say it's because intelligence has actually been redefined, not just education. It's also been reduced. Basically, these utilitarian values, it cannot even ask why man would have a soul or why it would come from God or anything transcendent. Basically, man now, in these eyes, has been desanctified. He doesn't have a soul, and basically, he's treated as some kind of biological machine at best. Thus, in education, going back to education, things like standardized testing is basically the only method for us to gauge intelligence, which also leads to really pressing topics like abortion, because then it's like, well, if someone's not going to lead a fulfilling, rational life, whether they're handicapped, well, then just kill them, right? Because they're not because you take out the transcendent principle. So let's go to ethics then. So especially through biotechnology. So I'm sure many in this room, if not all of us, have been blessed by modern medicine in some form. But the question is, when can this become obsessive? And as we can see with other ones, basically modern biotechnology, it can tell us how, it can give us the means how to live, but it cannot tell us why to live either. So basically, Archimandrite Akakios, he says in his paper, he says that man's preoccupation with his physical well-being is costing him his soul. So, and as I put it in my paper, I say, when does giving life become an excuse for avoid thinking of death? So when you take man's soul, God, the transcendent, and eternity out of the picture, only then do you find abortion, genocide, even cyborg experimentation, and human genetic engineering, and also other genetic engineering. You only find that in the picture because now things are completely secularized and there's no inherent dignity in anything. So in other words, man has been completely secularized. And this is, in fact, if you look at it, this is the same exact thinking that led to the destruction of the environment and nature through the Industrial Revolution. And what I say is that it was basically only a matter of time until this technological advancement that you see in like 1800s, like Britain and the US. It was only a matter of time until this technology would become so sophisticated that it would also basically start to destroy and dehumanize its creators in the process. And as Neil Postman says, such a technologically advanced society basically makes any alternative that is spiritual understanding of the world invisible and therefore irrelevant. And it does so by redefining what we mean by religion, by art, by family, by politics, by history, by truth, by privacy, by intelligence, so that our definitions fits its new requirements. In other words, such a technologically advanced society is totalitarian. We may not understand it, but it actually demands we think in materialistic ways. So ultimately, as I say, I would add on top of that, it ultimately affects the Christian struggle for salvation, what I also call spiritual orientation. So going back to the question of salvation then. So do believers in modern technology seek salvation? If you push this mode of thinking to its furthest limits, yes, they do in fact look for answers to abolish death, disease in radical forms. Basically, it's utopian thinking. So is it Christian salvation? No, it's materialistic salvation. So as technology advances, this is becoming more and more clear what I mean. And in one of my last chapters, it's called The Technological Utopia, An Exciting New Future. Basically, I point out that every form of utopian idealism has some kind of pseudo-spiritual worldview. For example, the Nazis. They envisioned a perfect race without war, a world without borders, and ultimately without disease because they believed that they had basically superior genes. And also in communism, you see this kind of spiritualized thinking because they believed in the destruction of classes. They wanted a classless society without oppression, which is painfully ironic because just these two regimes alone ended in the bloodiest not even century, maybe 70 years history has ever seen. So here's the question. Does today's technology-oriented world have its own pseudo-spiritual worldview as well? And the alarming answer is definitely yes. And this is a paraphrase from my thesis, if we look at advances in genetic engineering, organ cloning and harvesting, designer babies, attempts at creating part human, part machine cyborgs, the hope to download one's mind into supercomputers to attain digital immortality. None of this is a joke, by the way. None of these are jokes. The growing trend of virtual reality products, we see that what was once considered fringe transhumanist fantasies are in fact now becoming popular and even normal topics for people to consider and, most importantly, put their faith in. So basically it seems to be a Trojan horse. By putting faith in these technological advances, man has become a slave to its inherently dehumanizing process because it's a secularizing process. Man, like the rest of creation, has become yet another object to exploit, augment, and sell. And so here are some weird do-it-yourself programs. People are basically trying to fix their neurology or improve their neurology. And here's people, biohackers as they're known, basically just throwing technology in themselves. There's explicit ones that I don't add, don't worry, I keep it PG, but there's weird things like people trying to enhance their vision, and they're just opening their eyeballs and doing weird stuff. This is what happens if you don't have a purpose, I guess. So this is Sophia, the humanoid robot, who was actually even granted citizenship in Saudi Arabia in 2017. Which, if that doesn't sound demonic, I don't know what does. And here's Mark Zuckerberg controlling the masses. Virtual reality, and even though this next one is fake, it's very interesting. This is Elon Musk / Terminator, apparently. But basically, Elon Musk, he's very serious. He hopes to save man from what he considers an inevitable AI uprising by basically fusing man's nervous system with supercomputing technology. Basically, he believes that if you can't beat him, join him. He's actually created his own company called Neuralink, which is in its early stages, but he basically plans on releasing some things in 2019, actually. He was actually saying by the end of this year, but it seems like we're not there yet. So here's a question. Is this an icon of progress or of literal biological death, but most importantly, spiritual death? Last questions. So then most people ask, well then what are we to do? Basically what I say is that there's no other hope other than hope in God. We can't combat this humanistic thinking with more humanism. There's no movement we can start. Of course we can do things, but ultimately we can't just, we can't dig bunkers underground to avoid this. And ultimately, this is an attack on spirituality and the faith, and more than just Christianity. And what I say basically is desecration of humanity and nature must be combated with what I call resecration. Basically, we have to, as I say, this is not a matter of thoughts and actions, it is a matter of faith and identity. These things, what we find, all these things, the destruction of the environment and ourselves, ultimately comes from a desecrating worldview. So if we want to stop it, basically what the church has told us from day one is that we have to sanctify the world. So that's my grassroots movement, I guess you could say. So as the last question, I say, will we choose union and likeness with machine, the works of man, or with God? And this is the whole point of union likeness with God has been made possible through the God-man, Jesus Christ. And that's the entire point of the Christmas season, is that he came to become one of us. So, through shining examples like Father Seraphim Rose and other monastics. So, yeah.
So, I knew everyone was going to guess.
You pushed a few buttons.
I did.
I very much
Mostly the right.
Well,
Right.
what I'd like to know about is what precipitates this all-important shift in metaphysics from the older to this. Something happened. I mean, we can describe the consequences
Yeah.
of it. But what do you think caused it? Why did we abandon
Yeah.
a participatory metaphysics, let's say, for this?
Yeah.
You know, it's a,
Yeah.
Sherrard probably has some things to say.
Yeah,
about that.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean,
Sherrard, he gets more to the heart of it
yeah.
because he talks about the scientific worldview, which is really what the technological worldview stems from. But basically, he says that it is it's the secular. How can I put it? It's basically the secular worldview first through philosophy. So people like Descartes,
Right.
they hoped to attain basically truth, ultimate truth, through rational means. So
Right.
you find rationality is actually basically the stem of isolation and desecration. And then from there, basically, because you can't get anywhere through mere rationalism, you can't put God in your brain. Basically, from there, philosophy just gets pushed to the side, and then with that, religion. And then from there, basically, it's basically live and let live, do whatever you need to do. Nature's no longer sacred, man's no longer sacred. And then from there, technology, basically, he says that basically people think that basically the medievals, especially the medieval Christians, they believe that, you know, they suppressed their people by stopping technological advances and telling you to be humble in the, you know, in the face of God and all these things. And of course there was political manipulation at times, but he says that to think that they weren't technologically advanced and the ancients weren't technologically advanced because they didn't have the means to, or they were just too stuck in spirituality, is not the correct way of looking at it. It's actually anything that opposed what they knew to be the inherent unity and harmony of the universe, which came from God, or the transcendent at least, or the gods. Basically they just wouldn't accept it. So to say, okay, well, if we can have cars which can help us get places but destroys the environment, well, that's destructive to the inherent unity of the universe. So, and you can't really have overarching themes of harmony if you don't have something like the transcendent to begin with. So
Is there a replacement? I mean, can we, in addressing a culture that is largely secularized and has this sort of untrammeled faith in technology, can we use that to what you bring to bear here to address? There must be some metaphysics, right? It doesn't go away completely. There must be
it's just
something
mostly
people
absurdity.
believe in things, right? I mean,
yeah,
you know,
I mean,
there's a belief in technology that
Yeah.
undergirds all
yeah,
this,
exactly.
right?
See,
I mean,
faith doesn't disappear. That's the thing. It just
Yeah.
gets translated into
Yeah.
absurd things like we'll become cyborgs or we can
Yeah.
download our minds. So, yeah, it's mostly, yeah, it doesn't go away. That's what the communists thought. They thought they could
Right.
create an atheistic state that would be a utopia. But
Right.
instead, that just led to more absurd. It actually almost makes the Nazis look like a
Yeah,
play
right.
toy. Actually, if you look at the death count, I mean, the Nazis were only around 16 to 20 million. Meanwhile, I mean, communism has told, from communist China, USSR, Cuba, Venezuela, it's somewhere in the hundreds of millions. So no one talks about that.
Yeah,
That's weird.
the worst atrocities are committed by secular society.
Exactly.
And you see it usually driven by an idea
Exactly.
about humanity or,
Exactly.
or theology or anything. It's just this concept,
Yeah.
right, that drives it.
I agree with almost the whole thrust of your arguments. The quibble I have is the equation of the technological and the secular, which seem different in kind to me.
Okay.
The secular implies a philosophical worldview. Technological strikes me as simply a tool that can be used
Yeah.
to create ancient faith radio or
Yeah,
or
it's
create
true. It's
cyborgs.
not the same thing. It's that's why I say in my thesis that it supports a secular worldview. That's why I'm still using a computer. That's why we're still using a projector. I don't think that it is inherently negative. There can be inventions that are inherently negative, but whatever. Sorry, I lost my train of thought now.
Distracted.
Yeah, exactly. Distracted.
Well, you mentioned that, for example, phones, communication by a phone being reductive in some way.
Yeah.
And it is, I mean, it's not it doesn't have the same fullness as a human interaction, but the same could be said about pen and paper or a book.
No, yeah, that is true. In fact, actually, there is, I think Plato talks about that in his Timaeus, however you, basically it was the first man that was taught by the gods, I think either to write or something, and he thought that he was doing a great thing to society, but in fact, the god kind of laughs at him and says that basically you're going to be enabling like shorter thinking, like less memorization, all these things. So I also say that technology never comes without a price, and some advanced forms of technology can actually create paradigm shifts in how society even works, and not just even how it works, but how the people in these societies even view themselves through it. So
is the mechanism that drives that the technology remakes us, right? By habit, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the ancients and how they think about anthropology, and we become what we do on a regular basis, and because we're trained by the technology, it sort of remakes us.
exactly. Actually, Neil Postman says that.
The printing press probably did the same, and the effect was as profound.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
we
Yeah.
can't. Yeah, we're not going back in time.
Right.
These things are with us. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, as one last comment about that is that Neil Postman, he says he notices that people today consider themselves biological machines. So we'll talk about like reprogramming the way we think or things like this. So we see that we created machines, but then machines are somehow reflecting back on us and how we see ourselves. So yeah.
Well, there is certainly a demonic use of technology, and there are many, many examples of that.
Yeah.
But I think a case could be made that technology in itself is neutral.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
right.
Like, but I'm definitely not coming here to just destroy technology, because there are positive things. Biomedicine, just medicine, but biotechnology. The thing is, when it's unrestrained, that's when it has really strong reflecting factors, and it makes us think in a wholly secular manner, or it can, anyways. But,
Yeah, it seems like what's being tossed around here, which I think is correct, and I think you alluded to it earlier in the early part of your presentation, is that anything that we do in the material world without an orienting principle,
yeah,
if we have, because we're always going to have some orienting principle, right? And so a lot of us would prefer that people consciously have a Christian orienting principle that says, well, I can make this technology, but should I? And that seems to be like what your argument's getting at. The technology by itself is fine, but if it's not oriented in the correct way, then it can be extremely destructive,
Exactly.
which is, I think, the crux of like the whole discussion in some sense. And I think, even when we talk about, you had mentioned at one point in your presentation about rationality being kind of like something that's empty, but we forget that rationality itself was based off of Christian metaphysics, and people forget about that. But that's like a whole other thing.
But there's a huge shift around Descartes, which is what he's bringing up.
yeah.
Exactly,
He's the
exactly.
first modern
Yeah.
You
philosopher.
get this instrumental rationality.
Yes.
It's no longer participatory, it's instrumental.
Yes,
It's like, how
yes.
can we use things right,
Yeah.
certain outcomes?
But then with people
yeah.
like Galileo and Newton, they are able to back him up by basically creating a mechanistic understanding of the entire universe through basically the first wave of physics, Newtonian physics. Basically, he's able to support this rationalized way of thinking by creating, as I just said,
Yeah.
mechanistic.
But there were Christians then who were even saying, well, okay, you can have all this atomism and all this kind of stuff
Yeah.
that's going on, and God can still be the God of all of this, that's not a problem. But,
It leads to it. Yeah.
right,
It leads to it. Yeah.
I got a big dosage of draconian outlook right, out of this whole thing, right? So I don't know if it was your intent or not,
What's
but
draconian?
just like I have no faith in the world. Right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I mean, that's kind of, if I back up, I was like,
Yeah.
is that what I was supposed to get out of this? But I guess outside of that was,
Tell him to straighten it.
I think it's not. I think right there's. I don't think you have to choose between technology and spirituality.
Definitely no. Yeah,
And-
that's
and-
not what I'm
and-
saying. I definitely. Sorry.
No, and I guess there'd be a counter argument that says, look, not all, there's been plenty of deaths and wars started through religion and
Yeah.
Christianity specifically.
Yeah.
So is there a balance on this that
Yeah.
I'm missing or?
Well, I definitely had to kind of skim over it, so I had to like hit all the punches,
Yeah.
but I definitely could have, I guess, softened the corners a little bit. But yeah, definitely. That's why in my thesis, also I say it supports and not is or creates. Well, it can uphold that. So, yeah, it can definitely create a grim. It can draw a grim picture, but I mean.
Isn't that important to make that point?
Yeah,
And
I
how
mean,
absurd
it is. It does lead to absurdities.
it's where it's leading.
Yeah,
And that
it
we
does.
have to rein in and know our orientation.
Yeah.
And not be subject to these idols.
Yeah.
Right?
Ultimately,
and
it is
subject
idols.
ourselves to the
They
truth.
are idols. Yeah.
That's what I hear you saying.
Yeah.
So your punches are strong for a reason
And maybe
because of your orientation.
And maybe it's strong also because this is just a huge thing for today.
Yes.
You know? And maybe if there was another problem 300 years ago or 300 years into the future, God willing we last that long, I think it's just a really hot topic, and that's why maybe it does that for us. So.
And I don't think it's a balance either. I think it's understanding the right use of technology. Right? That's the issue.
Yeah.
There is
Yeah, that's
a right
really what
use
I'm
of
But isn't that true with
technology.
anything?
Yeah.
Isn't there any,
Yeah.
power, right? There's
Yeah.
a right use of power, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just seems like that's a separate subject, and technology is just the mechanism or
Yeah.
But
whatever to
yeah.
do that versus the balance between.
What I'm getting from Nick though is that yes, there's a right way of using technology and all this, but what we have is an underlying clash of worldviews.
Yeah.
When you strip everything away, the good and bad uses of technology and all this, what you have is two opposing worldviews that are diametrically opposed. There's no way that you can reconcile scientific materialism with a spiritual understanding of creation. Creation itself being a loaded word, of course.
Ultimately, but everyone falls into once it meets day-to-day life, that's very different.
Right. But what I want to say about this is that when we talk about right use of technology, you cannot talk about right use of technology or wrong use
Yeah.
of technology
Without
unless you
morality.
have that worldview
Yeah.
in place.
Without morality, yeah,
if-
exactly.
because
Which comes from transcendence.
But yes, because a biohacker will say, no, the right use of technology is that we can change, that we can have designer babies, or we can
Yeah.
hack into your body or my body to actually change it. But that's where I think what I'm hearing Nick saying is wait a minute, that's not a right use of technology because that is not a spiritual worldview. It's not coming from a worldview that is Christian. See, and that's why I think it's so deceptive, because technology presents itself as this neutral, positive thing, which it is. It is positive, but it's that underlying "how shall we use it"
Yes.
question
Yes.
that needs to be addressed. So, my question to you then, Nicholas, is what are your thoughts on that? I mean,
Yeah.
how do you see this happening? I mean, what can we do?
Well, like I said, there's a lot of people that ask me that once I say that, and I believe that, I guess you could start some kind of movement, but I'm definitely not calling for some kind of let's be Amish. You know what I mean? But what I am saying is let's be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Let's be honest, meaning,
and
what do
I
you mean
think-
by that?
well, let's be honest with what these things mean and how it
How
can be affecting us.
Gotcha.
And ultimately, like I said, I guess my grassroots movement would be ultimately, taking the spiritual life seriously, actually wondering about these things, just starting to wonder, and then from there actually maybe take personal action. Just in, St. John Chrysostom says that if there's just 2 or 3 Christians, real Christians in a single city, they can light the whole place up with faith. So,
Right.
so which is much different than say, the more humanistic thinking of say the Spanish Inquisition, which is or even the more political understanding of Christianity, which is just dominate and baptize, and there's so many grays just in that, you know what I mean? So it's there's real Christians and there's political Christians, and that's how it's always going to be. There's going to be this inner and outer. So.
Okay. Very good. Very challenging.
Yeah, you have a tough audience.
Yeah, we
Hostile.
We grilled you there for a while.
Hostile. That's very good.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. That was.